Welcome to CapitolView, where we discuss the latest in state government and politics. I'm Hannah Meisel with NPR Illinois. Joining us this week is Kent Redfield, Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Illinois, Springfield. Thanks for being here, Kent.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
And also here is Peter Hancock of Capital News Illinois. Glad you're here, Peter.
Hi, good to see you, Hannah.
Well, somehow we've made it to December in another very long year, another pandemic year. But Peter, one thing that has dominated Springfield since March is, the once in a decade redistricting process. Of course, the most hyper-partisan thing that could possibly happen, in the Capitol. And, this is a process that of course, was thrown off by COVID. But once it got going, this is my first redistricting process. Kent, I'm sure you can speak to the history more, but things just kept coming up and, a lot of bumpy roads. But Peter, we are finally at the point where court will finally weigh in on the legislative maps and determine whether or not they're going to go forward exactly as the Democrats drew them, or, they need some adjustment. So tell us, what's at stake next week?
Well, there are three sets of plaintiffs, and mainly they're looking at Hispanic areas in Chicago and the southwest suburbs, and African-American communities around East St. Louis, the Metro East region. The Republican leadership, which was the first to jump in the game, is challenging both. There's a Latino advocacy group called the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, or MALDEF. They're focusing solely on Chicago. And the East St. Louis branch of the NAACP, along with a couple other groups, are focusing on the Metro East region. Briefs have been going on really all summer and all through the fall, even through the second redistricting process. And so we are tentatively scheduled to have oral arguments before a 3-judge federal panel in Chicago starting Tuesday. Although earlier this week, 2 of the plaintiffs said they don't think they need oral arguments. There are plenty of briefs and depositions of expert witnesses that they don't need to call, oral testimony or in-person testimony. The NAACP still wants to have oral arguments, but they don't necessarily need to call any witnesses. The only question is whether the judges want to have oral arguments, because they may have some particular questions of their own that they want to get some answers to. So probably by the time this airs, we'll know the answer to that. But as of right now, that's still up in the air.
Right. And Ken, this, as Peter alluded to, the main question, the main really legal force that the plaintiffs have are whether or not these districts that Democrats drew violate the Voting Rights Act, especially when it comes to Latino voting power. The NAACP and, the other groups who filed pretty late in the game, in the case of the East St. Louis districts that they claim are diluting the Black community's votes there, they're not really the threat. They have arguments, and the judges said, sure, we'll take, your arguments under advisement. But really, what's at stake here is what's always been at stake, is that the Latino communities have been growing in Illinois. Latino population, that was the whole story of the 2020 census, not just in Illinois, but nationwide. And it's the culmination of a years-long effort. And MALDEF, like Peter mentioned, is one of the lead plaintiffs here. They're the only group who, in Illinois' history of redistricting, has ever had success at the courts.
Yeah, and we should note that the congressional map, there was an agreement on the last revision to add an additional Hispanic, Latino congressional district, and at the moment, I don't know that there's any litigation in relation to that. And clearly we are, this is very narrow. We're in federal court, and the whole question involves one particular section of the Voting Rights Act in terms of that you cannot diminish minority voting representation. It gets very technical in terms of exactly what involves concepts like polarized and non-polarized, voting in terms of on the basis of race. And so, there are a lot of technical arguments, but ultimately, certainly in Chicago, it's a question of how many districts are going to be represented by Hispanic members, how many are going to be represented by, Black members. And that's, it doesn't, there's no partisan aspect to that. So it's fairly narrow. It's very technical, but it is a very, very contentious issue. And, the inability of the Chicago City Council to draw new maps centers around this question of exactly, how many districts is it likely to get either, Latino or African American, members elected. And it is complicated by the fact that you are looking at voting populations that tend, particularly in terms of Hispanic voters, may not have as high of a turnout. And so when you just look at raw numbers, that may be deceiving in terms of what you might expect on, election day. So very complicated, very contentious. Probably, it may not, end up with much impact in terms of the overall number of Democrats and Republicans, unless the court were to accept the Republicans' suggestions, which would essentially ripple out the effect of changing these districts in ways that would have advantaged the Republicans. Same thing's true in terms of the different perspectives of what ought to be going on in the Metro East.
Sure, and but Republicans all throughout this legal process, it seems as if the judges who have been involved in this have not necessarily bought their arguments. And after all, the U.S. Supreme Court has, kind of been hands off of partisan gerrymandering. The only thing that it seems like federal courts are going to weigh in on is this Voting Rights Act challenge. But, Peter, I wanted to bring up what Kent just mentioned, which is that this week at Chicago City Council, we've seen the whole process blow up. There's kind of an arbitrary deadline, kind of like what we had in July with the constitutional deadline to avoid a appointed commission to do the remap process. Anyway, it's really interesting though. From the beginning of this process, obviously, with the story that we knew of Latino voting power increasing, and the census numbers were going to bear that out, but also the increased power of the Black Caucus, especially in partnership, hand in glove with former House Speaker Mike Madigan for decades, it was going to be contentious because we know that Illinois is losing some of its Black population and obviously gaining Latino and also Asian American populations. And so it was going to be contentious, but purposefully, those redistricting committees in the House and Senate were chaired and co-chaired each by a Latino and a Black caucus member. And whatever fights that went on behind the scenes, they stayed purely behind closed doors. It's kind of amazing. There was, pretty much no media leaks, unlike City Council, where there is now all-out public fights between the Black caucus and Latino caucus. How important is that cohesion as we move on from this remapping process finally?
Well, I'll be the first to admit I do not understand all of the ethnic and racial divides inside the city of Chicago. One thing I do find interesting is how you see Republicans and Latinos in Illinois, at least, are largely Democratic voters, and they're kind of in the same corner on this. Latinos are trying to increase their representation in the General Assembly. And for purposes of this, the Republicans are fine with that, because when you pack Latinos into Latino districts, it kind of frees things up for Republican candidates in the largely white middle-class suburban areas. Those middle-class suburban areas in the collar counties and elsewhere have used to be considered safe Republican districts. And the last few election cycles, 2016, 2018, 2020, started leaning a lot more Democratic. At this point, and Kent, you can weigh in on this too, it's kind of hard to tell whether that was a true political shift or if that was just kind of a unique reaction to Bruce Rauner and Donald Trump. I think in 2022, we'll find out, how permanent or how stable that shift has been. The East St. Louis area is interesting. The city of East St. Louis itself lost more than 30% of its population since the last census. African Americans, especially middle-class African Americans, have been leaving East St. Louis and going to the surrounding suburbs. Suburban areas that used to be kind of highly competitive, but now are largely Democratic, and the Democrats are hoping to keep it that way. But in doing so, they also sort of broke up the African American population. So oddly enough, you could have 3 House members from the Metro East region, none of them being Black.
Yeah, and that would be a huge change. And again, that is what the NAACP intervened in this case for. And I obviously, too, it's the power of the incumbency, and folks like LaToya Greenwood and Chris Belts and the folks who came before them and built those political organizations don't want to see that happen. But Kent, you had mentioned the congressional map before, which the governor finally signed shortly before Thanksgiving. And, from what I'm hearing, there probably is not going to be a legal challenge, or at least not a very serious one. I mean, here we are filming on December 2nd, and things really need to be wrapped up before early mid-January so people can start circulating the petitions. But, finally, after the Thanksgiving holiday, keeping us all in suspense for so many months, Congressman Rodney Davis finally revealed that, big surprise, he is going to, instead of run for governor, just run for a 6th term in Congress instead of in the 13th district House seat that he has held for, since 2012. He'll run in the newly drawn 15th House district. Tell us a little bit about, where Rodney was on the maps, and what this means for the rest of the delegation.
Well, the district that he had went, along, went from Champaign, picked up some of Bloomington Normal, went down Springfield, went down close to the Metro East, but not into that area. And the new map creates a district that leans Democratic, that covers, a lot of Bloomington Normal, goes over to Champaign, runs down from Springfield, and then runs into the Metro East, picking up areas that Representative Boss has been, or Congressman Boss has been representing. But those areas were in Boss's district because they assumed that then incumbent Congressman Costello, who is a Democrat, was going to get run and get reelected, and the Democrats would have a Metro East district, and they would have a Central Illinois district that was competitive. And now we've got a district that's very Democratic by downstate standards in the 13th. There's also a district that Boustros used to represent, the 17th, that goes from Rockford to Quad Cities and then comes down and picks up urban Peoria and urban Bloomington Normal, at which leans Democratic, but is very competitive. And certainly a Republican could win in a Republican year, depending on what the issues are. So it's like making a 5-piece jigsaw puzzle where you've got 2 pieces that have a very definite boundaries, and then you get to draw the boundaries to make the other 3 pieces. You can make them any way they look, any boundaries, as long as you've got equal population. And so, that's what you've got. You've got 3 leftover districts, district that the boss is in, the 18th. You've got the district that Representative LaHood is running in, which is the 16th, I think. No, which one's Dave? One is Davis and one is LaHood. And so, Davis, has a very safe district. It is huge. And we've left Congressman Miller sitting there having to choose between running against Congressman Boss or Congressman LaHood, because the Democrats conveniently moved the boundaries in the very last iteration of the map, a mile to the north to stick her in Representative Boss district, which is, south of the Metro East. So Davis did the right thing. If he gets elected to Congress and gets elected, which he will, and the House goes Republican, he'll be chair of the Transportation Committee, which is a very powerful position. That's a much better bet than hoping that Ken Griffin might bankroll your governor's election to run against what is still a popular incumbent in Governor Pritzker.
Right. And, Rodney Davis, this is not a surprise. I was listening back to what Congressman Davis told us reporters at the state fair, and he, said he would rather remain in Congress, but said that his political future depended on the quote unquote corrupt Democrats in Springfield, who then, drew him this nice safe district. It's also, could Davis have won statewide? That's an open question. We, might never know. Davis's voting record certainly, aligned with Trump, and it has gotten a lot more conservative in the years that he's been in Washington, but he can certainly run a ground game. So, Peter, speaking of the governor's race, this, of course, still leaves the 4 Republicans who have declared in play, and we don't know yet who might jump in with the backing of Ken Griffin, Dick Uihlein, these big conservative mega donors. But give us just briefly the state of play there.
Well, right now you have 4 Republicans who are all very, very conservative Republicans. And I think a lot of people are sitting back waiting to see if somebody a little more moderate might get in the race. And here again, the key to winning, especially for a Republican to win the governor's office, is going to be those Collier County suburbs. Are they going to stay Democratic, or will they go for a more centrist, kind of moderate Republican? I think a lot of people were maybe hoping that, Rodney Davis, he votes very conservatively, but at least he's not scary to suburbanites. There's also State Representative Tom Demmer from Dixon, who has said that he's maybe eyeing a statewide race, but he hasn't said yet. Last we heard was he's going to announce pretty soon. Unsure whether he would try for governor or secretary of state. So that's kind of the state of play right now, is they're sitting back waiting to see if some more centrist, moderate Republicans who can play well in the suburbs will get into any of the statewide races.
Right. And we should mention, also in the mix is State Senator Darren Bailey, who made a name for himself last year when he very loudly and repeatedly defied the governor's COVID orders, and then hired attorney Tom DeVore, who turned into something of a political star himself, to represent him in all of these anti-COVID restriction lawsuits. And of course, Tom Demmer is now running for a seat on the state's 4th District Appellate Court. Anyway, in some breaking news yesterday, Wednesday evening, a friend, political ally, someone that the campaign had definitely had in tow for a while this year, Lawrence Ligas, he was arrested for his role in the January 6th insurrection. And, it's interesting. I don't know, Kent, do you think that the Republican Party is going to have to contend with that at some point? Because, I was listening back again to audio from the state fair when Ligas was weirdly trying to get into our reporter scrum and was yelling at new-ish now state GOP chair Don Tracy. And then I asked Don Tracy, does the Republican Party have a role to play in owning up to this? And he said, no, we're moving on. I don't know, Kent, do you think that there's any amount of owning up that needs to be done?
Well, his involvement and the person that got arrested has been charged, rather. He's been active in doing things for Bailey's campaign and has, clearly is a supporter. That's good for Bailey's brand in terms of the way he wants to present himself. That's great for a Republican primary. That's terrible for a general election. And, I agree, the race is going, these contests statewide are usually settled in the suburbs. And, you've got the suburbs have become much more racially diverse over the last 20 years, less so in the last decade than the decade before. There's been a huge cultural shift. And so issues like gay marriage, like gay rights, like abortion have been, have hurt Republicans in suburban, more moderate suburban districts. No one knows what will happen with the Supreme Court's dealing with overturning Roe, but that could be a significant issue with suburban voters. Democrat, I assume the governor would make it a very significant issue. And, Bailey would clearly, or any of the other 3 announced Republicans would be on the wrong side of that in terms of, and would, you use the word scary, and that's what the Democrats will try to do is demonize whoever the Republican nominee is, if at all possible, to be a scary Trump, right-wing, anti-woman, anti-gay kind of a candidate. And but that profile may be, still has a lot of currency in winning a Republican primary. That's where, and so it's a dilemma for the Republicans. And, I don't know whether, is COVID going to dominate the election? Is inflation going to dominate the election? Is abortion, and so it's really hard to say exactly how the electorate is going to, coalesce around statewide races. And the Republicans, they finally have a candidate to run for Secretary of State that everybody seems to be comfortable with, but there's not much of an organization, and they're really dependent on the good graces of mega donors coming in and deciding this is a good place to spend their money. And they might the mega donors may very well decide that state Supreme Court races, of which there'll be 2 very, competitive races, may be a better, that may be a better place to put their money than trying to go one-on-one with Governor Pritzker. So very hard to tell at this point, but the Democrats, the Republicans definitely need a bigger, more unified ticket and a coherent message that is a general election message. And getting there from here, looks difficult at this point, but this is a lifetime before, we actually get people voting, less than a year from now.
Well, we are almost out of time, but I did want to mention here at the end, we had two resignations, or at least one immediate resignation, one announcement of won't be running again in the House this week. Majority Leader Greg Harris, Democrat from Chicago's Northwest Side, best known, of course, for sponsoring the same-sex marriage bill in 2013 and civil unions before that, announced that he will not be seeking another term, but he'll be staying probably till the end of his term in early 2023. And then, of course, right here in Springfield, Mike Murphy, a Republican who has served for the last 3 years, kind of a casualty of the Democrats' maps. And he announced that he will be stepping down, not unexpected. He'll be leading the greater Springfield Chamber of Commerce. And he, of course, he didn't want to have to run against Representative Avery Bourne, a friend of his, of course, a rising star in the Republican Party. Just didn't make sense for him. So he stepped down effective immediately this week. But we are out of time again. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Hannah Meisel. I'd like to thank our guests, Kent Redfield, Peter Hancock. We'll catch you again next week on Capitol View.